The distant wail of her son's crying cut through the thin walls of their dilapidated cabin like a knife through butter. Lillian Davenport pressed her forehead against the cool glass of her bedroom mirror, fingers trembling as they traced the long golden strands of her hair. It was 1876 in Nevada City, California, and winter had arrived with a vengeance, bringing with it frost-laden mornings and barren pantries. "Hush now, Thomas," she called, her voice steadier than she felt. "Mama's coming." Lillian turned away from the mirror, tucking a loose strand behind her ear as she moved to the small bedroom where her 4-year-old son lay in his bed, cheeks flushed with hunger and eyes glistening with tears. "I'm hungry," Thomas whimpered, his small hand clutching at the threadbare blanket. "I know, my love." Lillian scooped him into her arms, rocking him gently. "And Mama is going to fix that, I promise." The promise weighed heavily on her shoulders as she glanced around their modest cabin. 2 years had passed since influenza had taken her husband, James, leaving her alone with a toddler and mounting debts. She tried everything, taking in washing, mending clothes, even cleaning at the saloon, until the owner's wandering hands had forced her to quit. Each passing day, the hole in her pocket grew deeper, and the growl in Thomas's stomach grew louder. But there was one thing she had left to sell. Lillian had heard whispers among the women in town. Long, untreated hair could fetch a decent price. Wigmakers back east were always looking for quality strands to craft their expensive pieces. And if there was one thing Lillian had been blessed with, it was her cascade of golden hair that fell past her waist, the envy of many in Nevada City. With a deep breath, she settled Thomas back on his bed. "Stay here, sweetheart. I'm going to see Mrs. Jenkins next door. She'll look after you while Mama goes into town." "But you just got back from town," Thomas protested, his small face scrunched in confusion. Lillian kissed his forehead. "I know, but I forgot something important. I won't be long." After leaving Thomas with their elderly neighbor, Lillian wrapped a woolen shawl around her shoulders and headed into town. Nevada City hummed with the usual activity: miners trudging to and from the gold fields, merchants hawking their wares, and the occasional sound of a piano drifting from the saloon. Her destination was a small, nondescript building at the edge of town with a faded sign that read "Johnson's Barber and Sundries." Taking a deep breath, she pushed open the door, causing a small bell to tinkle above her head. Mr. Johnson, a portly man with a balding head and bushy mustache, looked up from his paper. "Mrs. Davenport," he greeted, surprise evident in his voice. "What brings you here today? Not a haircut for the boy, surely?" "No," Lillian replied, her voice barely above a whisper. She reached up and untied the ribbon that held her hair back, letting the golden locks cascade around her shoulders. I heard you buy hair." Understanding dawned on the barber's face, his expression shifting from surprise to something akin to pity. "Ah, I see." He gestured for her to sit in the chair. "Yes, I do occasionally purchase hair for wigmakers back east. Yours would fetch a good price. It's untreated and a desirable color." Lillian nodded, her throat tight. "How much?" Mr. Johnson examined her hair, running his fingers through the strands, assessing the length and quality. "I could give you $15. It wasn't a fortune, but it would be enough to buy groceries for a few weeks, maybe even pay part of the rent." Lillian swallowed her pride and nodded. "Are you certain, Mrs. Davenport?" Mr. Johnson asked, his voice gentle. "Once it's cut, there's no going back." "I'm certain," she said firmly, though her heart ached at the thought of losing the one thing that had always made her feel beautiful. "My son needs to eat." With a solemn nod, Mr. Johnson retrieved his scissors. "I'll try to leave enough that it's still presentable," he promised. Lillian closed her eyes as the cold metal of the scissors pressed against her neck. The first snip sounded unnaturally loud in the quiet shop, and she felt the weight of her hair begin to lessen with each cut. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. This was necessary, a sacrifice any mother would make. Unknown to Lillian, a tall figure stood frozen in the doorway of the barber shop, having entered just as the first strands of her hair fell to the floor. Dane Irving had ridden into Nevada City just 3 days prior, his reputation as one of the most skilled horse trainers in the West preceding him. He'd been hired by the wealthy mine owner, George Wilson, to tame a particularly spirited stallion that had thrown every cowhand who'd attempted to ride it. At 30 years old, Dane was a man who had seen much of the harsh realities of the frontier. His face, weathered by sun and wind, bore the marks of a life lived outdoors, and his calloused hands spoke of years of hard work. But it was his eyes, a deep, piercing blue, that often caught people's attention. They reflected a quiet intelligence and a kindness that seemed at odds with his rugged appearance. Now, those eyes widened in shock as he watched the scene unfolding before him. The woman in the chair, her back to him, was clearly in distress, despite her efforts to hide it. And as her golden hair fell in clumps to the floor, he couldn't help but feel as though he was witnessing something deeply private and painful. Mr. Johnson, noticing him in the doorway, paused mid-cut. "Mr. Irving, I'll be with you in a moment." Lillian's eyes flew open, embarrassment flooding her cheeks as she realized they had an audience. She turned slightly, catching sight of the tall cowboy in the doorway, his expression a mixture of confusion and concern. I can come back later," Dane said, his deep voice unexpectedly gentle. "No need," Lillian replied quickly, wanting to get the ordeal over with. "Mr. Johnson won't be long." Dane hesitated, torn between giving her privacy and an inexplicable desire to understand what had driven this woman to such a desperate act. He'd seen her around town in the past few days, always with a small boy in tow, always in modest but clean clothing, her head held high despite the whispers that followed her. A widow, someone had told him, struggling to make ends meet. Making a decision, he stepped fully into the shop, closing the door behind him. "Actually, Mr. Johnson, I was hoping to speak with you about something else entirely." He moved closer, his voice lowering. "I understand you sometimes act as a broker for those in need of certain items." The barber's eyebrows rose. "I offer various services, yes." Dane nodded, his eyes briefly meeting Lillian's in the mirror. "I find myself in need of groceries, quite a lot of them, in fact, for the Wilson Ranch." It was a lie, but a necessary one. "I was told you might know which merchants offer the best prices." Mr. Johnson frowned, clearly confused by the request, but before he could respond, Dane continued, "And I'm willing to pay handsomely for the information. Say $20. Lillian's breath caught in her throat as she realized what the stranger was doing. Pride made her want to refuse, to tell him she didn't need charity, but the thought of Thomas's hungry face kept her silent. Well, that's quite generous," Mr. Johnson stammered. "I'd be happy to provide such information." Dane nodded, reaching into his pocket and pulling out the money. He placed it on the counter, deliberately avoiding looking at Lillian, sensing her discomfort. "And I believe the lady was here first. Perhaps you should complete her transaction." Mr. Johnson glanced between them, understanding dawning on his face. "Of course." He turned back to Lillian. "Mrs. Davenport, it seems I've overestimated the market value of your hair. I can only offer $5 today." Lillian's heart sank. $5 would barely buy enough food for a few days. "But you said market fluctuations," Mr. Johnson said quickly, his eyes darting to Dane. "However, I do have a proposition. I've been looking for someone to help with some mending shirts specifically. If you're interested, I could pay you $15 in advance." Dane watched as a myriad of emotions crossed Lillian's face: confusion, realization, pride, and finally, reluctant acceptance. She needed the money too desperately to refuse. "That's very kind," she finally said, her voice thick with unshed tears. "I'd be happy to help with the mending." Mr. Johnson smiled, relief evident on his face. "Excellent. And since we've already started, shall I finish the cut?" "Perhaps not as short as originally planned, just enough for a fashionable style." Lillian nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Yes, please." As Mr. Johnson resumed his work, now taking care to create a stylish bob rather than simply hacking off her hair for sale, Dane moved to a chair by the window, pretending to be interested in a newspaper. But his eyes kept drifting to the reflection of the woman in the mirror, her dignity intact despite the circumstances that had brought her here. When Mr. Johnson finished, Lillian stood, her hand automatically reaching up to touch her newly shortened hair. It fell just below her chin, framing her face in a way that accentuated her high cheekbones and expressive eyes. "It suits you," Dane said quietly, surprising himself with the comment. Lillian looked at him, really looked at him for the first time. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of strength that came from years of hard work rather than vanity. His face, though weathered, had a kindness to it that was rare in these parts, especially among strangers. "Thank you," she replied, the words encompassing more than just the compliment. Mr. Johnson handed her $15 along with a small package of shirts to be mended. "Take your time with these, Mrs. Davenport. No rush." Dane stood as she prepared to leave. "Mrs. Davenport, if you don't mind, I was heading to the general store myself. Perhaps I could accompany you." Lillian hesitated, wary of the stranger's intentions despite his kindness. But something in his eyes and earnestness, a lack of the predatory gleam she'd seen in other men's gazes, made her nod. "That would be fine, Mr. Irving. Dane Irving." Outside, the cold air nipped at Lillian's exposed neck, a new sensation after years of having her hair as a natural scarf. She shivered, adjusting her shawl. "Cold?" Dane asked, concern lacing his voice. "A bit," she admitted. "I'm not used to this." She gestured to her hair. Dane unfolded his kerchief and offered it to her. "For your neck. It's clean, I promise." Lillian accepted the gesture with a small smile, wrapping the soft fabric around her neck. As they walked toward the general store, an awkward silence fell between them, neither quite sure how to address what had happened. Finally, Dane spoke. "I apologize if I overstepped back there." Lillian shook her head. "No, thank you, but I can't accept charity. The mending is a fair exchange." "It wasn't charity," Dane insisted gently. "It was." He trailed off, searching for the right words. "One human being helping another, I suppose." They reached the general store, its windows displaying an array of goods that Lillian had been carefully rationing for weeks. Inside, the warm scent of spices and coffee greeted them, along with rows of canned goods, sacks of flour and sugar, and barrels of apples and potatoes. "What do you need?" Dane asked, reaching for a basket. Lillian hesitated, the money in her pocket suddenly feeling both precious and burdensome. "Just the essentials," she said. "Flour, some beans, perhaps a bit of sugar for Thomas, my son." Dane nodded, helping her gather the items. As they moved through the store, he discreetly added more to their basket: a small jar of honey, a package of dried apples, a tin of coffee, and a small bottle of vanilla extract, luxuries she would never have allowed herself. When they reached the counter, Lillian's eyes widened at the total. "I can't possibly. Consider it an advance on future mending." Dane interrupted smoothly, meeting the shopkeeper's curious gaze with a steady one of his own. Mrs. Davenport has kindly agreed to help with some repairs at the Wilson Ranch. I'm merely ensuring she has the strength to do so. The shopkeeper, a man named Harold Mills who had known Lillian since before her husband's death, looked between them with a raised eyebrow but said nothing. He wrapped their purchases in brown paper and handed them to Dane. Outside the store, Lillian turned to face him, her expression a mixture of gratitude and determination. "Mr. Irving, while I appreciate your kindness, I can't accept all this without a proper arrangement. If you truly have mending that needs to be done, I'm more than capable. But I won't be indebted to a stranger, no matter how well-intentioned." Dane studied her for a moment, admiration flickering in his eyes. "Fair enough, Mrs. Davenport. As it happens, I do have a proposition for you. I've been hired to train horses for George Wilson, and I'll be staying in town for at least a few months. I've rented a small cabin, but I'm afraid domestic matters aren't my strong suit. I could use someone to help with cooking and mending a few times a week. I'd pay you fairly, of course." Lillian considered his offer. It sounded legitimate and the work wouldn't interfere with caring for Thomas. Plus, she'd heard of George Wilson everyone in Nevada City had. If this man was working for Wilson, he was likely reputable. "I have a son," she reminded him. "He's 4. He'd have to come with me." Dane's expression softened. "Of course, I'm fond of children, and I'm sure he'd enjoy seeing the horses." Lillian took a deep breath. "Very well, Mr. Irving, I accept your proposition. When would you like me to start? Tomorrow, if it suits you. Say midday." "My cabin is just off Pine Street, the small one with the red door." "I know it," Lillian nodded. "We'll be there." As they parted ways, Lillian couldn't help but feel a strange mixture of relief and apprehension. The groceries in her arms would feed Thomas for weeks, and the promise of steady work was more than she had dared hope for. Yet there was something unsettling about the intensity of Dane Irving's gaze, the way he seemed to see through her carefully constructed facade of strength. Little did she know that Dane was experiencing his own turmoil. As he watched her walk away, her newly shortened hair catching the winter sunlight, he found himself wondering about the woman who would sell her crown of glory to feed her child, and why fate had placed him in that barber shop at that precise moment. The next day dawned clear and cold, the kind of crisp winter morning that painted the world in shades of silver and blue. Lillian woke early, as was her habit, and found herself reaching for hair that was no longer there as she prepared to pin it up for the day. The shock of her shortened locks sent a momentary pang through her heart, but it was quickly replaced by determination. Today marked a new beginning: steady work, food in the pantry, and perhaps a bit of dignity restored. Thomas was unusually excited for the day, bouncing on his toes as she helped him dress in his warmest clothes. "Will there really be horses, Mama?" he asked for the third time, his eyes wide with anticipation. "Yes, love," Lillian assured him, tucking a woolen scarf around his neck. "Mr. Irving works with horses, and he said you might see them, but you must promise to be very good and not get in the way. This is important work for Mama." Thomas nodded solemnly, his small face serious. "I promise. I'll be the goodest boy ever." Lillian smiled, her heart warming at his enthusiasm. "The best boy ever," she corrected gently, kissing his forehead. "Now let's have some breakfast before we go." Thanks to the groceries from the previous day, she was able to prepare a hearty breakfast of oatmeal sweetened with a precious spoonful of honey, a luxury that brought such delight to Thomas's face that Lillian had to blink back tears. It had been too long since she'd been able to provide such simple pleasures for her son. As they made their way through town toward Pine Street, Lillian found herself wondering more about Dane Irving. He was clearly not from Nevada City, yet he moved with the confidence of a man who knew his place in the world. His intervention at the barber shop had been unexpected and, in many ways, unsettling. She wasn't accustomed to kindness without conditions, not since James had died. The cabin with the red door came into view, small but well-maintained, set slightly apart from its neighbors with a modest yard and a lean-to that likely served as a small stable. Smoke curled from the chimney, suggesting that Dane was already awake and had a fire going. Thomas tugged at her hand. "Is this it, Mama? Does Mr. Irving live here?" "Yes, darling. Remember what we talked about. Be polite and don't get in the way," Thomas finished for her, his expression serious despite the excitement dancing in his eyes. Lillian straightened her shoulders, adjusted her shawl, and approached the door. Before she could knock, it swung open, revealing Dane Irving, dressed in simple work clothes but somehow looking more imposing than he had the day before. "Mrs. Davenport," he greeted with a warm smile, then lowered his gaze to Thomas. "And this must be the young man I've heard about." Thomas stared up at him, momentarily shy in the presence of the tall stranger. Then, with the resilience of childhood, he blurted, "Do you really have horses?" Dane chuckled, the sound rich and genuine. "I do, indeed. Would you like to see them after your mother and I discuss her work?" Thomas nodded eagerly, and Lillian felt a rush of gratitude for Dane's easy manner with her son. Many men found children, especially other men's children, to be an inconvenience at best. "Please come in." Dane stepped aside, revealing a cabin that was tidy but clearly in need of a woman's touch. The furniture was sparse but functional: a table with 4 chairs, a small sofa near the fireplace, and doors leading to what were presumably bedrooms. "I apologize for the state of things. I've been focused on the horses since I arrived." "It's perfectly fine," Lillian assured him, taking in the space with a practiced eye. There was dust on the surfaces and the floors could use a good sweeping, but overall, the cabin was in better shape than she had expected for a bachelor's residence. Dane gestured toward the table, where a pot of coffee sat alongside 2 cups. "Would you care for some coffee? And perhaps some milk for the boy?" "Coffee would be lovely, thank you," Lillian said, helping Thomas out of his coat and settling him with a small wooden toy he'd brought along. As Dane poured the coffee, he outlined what he had in mind. "I'm at the Wilson Ranch most days from dawn until mid-afternoon, working with the horses. I could use someone to come in 3 days a week, perhaps Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, to keep the place tidy, do any mending that's needed, and perhaps prepare a meal that I can reheat in the evening." He named a sum that was generous by any standard, causing Lillian's eyes to widen slightly. "That's more than fair," she said, taking a sip of the surprisingly good coffee. "I can certainly manage those tasks, and I appreciate your understanding about Thomas." Dane waved a hand dismissively. "He's welcome here. The cabin gets quiet and a child's laughter would be a pleasant change." His eyes softened as he watched Thomas, who was now making his toy gallop across the table. "He reminds me of my younger brother at that age, full of energy and curiosity." "You have family?" Lillian asked, realizing she knew virtually nothing about this man who had so unexpectedly entered their lives. A shadow crossed Dane's face. "They're gone now. Pa died in the war, Ma and my brother from fever a few years later." "I'm sorry," Lillian said softly, recognizing the familiar pain of loss in his eyes. "It's not easy being alone." "No," Dane agreed, his gaze meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "It's not." For a moment, they sat in companionable silence, 2 souls who understood the weight of grief all too well. Then Thomas, oblivious to the undercurrent of emotion, piped up. "Can we see the horses now, Mr. Irving? Please?" Dane laughed, the melancholy vanishing from his expression. I suppose we can. What do you say, Mrs. Davenport? Shall we show the young man my four-legged friends before you start your work? Lillian nodded, grateful for the break in tension. That would be fine, and please call me Lillian, Mrs. Davenport feels so formal for someone who will be cleaning your home. Lillian, Dane repeated, as if testing the name on his tongue. A beautiful name, and you must call me Dane. They stepped outside into the crisp winter air, Thomas bouncing with excitement as Dane led them toward the lean-to. Inside were two horses, a sturdy bay gelding that Dane introduced as Copper, and a more delicate pinto mare named Star. They're magnificent, Lillian breathed, admiring the well-cared-for animals. Can I pet them? Thomas asked, his voice hushed with awe. Dane lifted the boy up, supporting him carefully as he guided Thomas's small hand to Star's velvet nose. Gently, that's it. She's friendly, but you must always approach horses with respect. Thomas's delighted giggle as the mare nuzzled his palm was a sound Lillian hadn't heard in too long. Watching him interact with Dane, she felt a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the winter sun now streaming through the lean-to's open side. After the horses had been properly admired, Dane showed them back to the cabin and explained in more detail what needed to be done. It was straightforward work, cleaning, mending, and cooking, the kind Lillian had done all her life. But the prospect of doing it in this peaceful cabin, with fair pay and a kind employer, made it seem less like drudgery and more like opportunity. As the weeks passed, a routine established itself. 3 days a week, Lillian and Thomas would make their way to the red-doored cabin. While she cleaned and mended, Thomas would either help with simple tasks or play with the toys. Dane mysteriously produced a small wooden horse one day, a set of blocks another. And always, before they left, there would be a visit to the horses, with Dane patiently teaching Thomas about their care and handling. Dane himself was often gone when they arrived, busy with his work at the Wilson Ranch. But he would return mid-afternoon, sometimes bearing small treats for Thomas, or a book he thought Lillian might enjoy. At first, she was wary of these gifts, but Dane's manner was so genuine, so devoid of the ulterior motives she had come to expect from men, that she gradually began to accept them for what they were: simple kindnesses. On days when he returned early, Dane would sometimes join them for the meal Lillian had prepared, insisting that they share it with him rather than leaving it for later. These impromptu dinners became quiet moments of connection, with Thomas chattering about his discoveries of the day, Dane sharing tales of the horses he was training, and Lillian finding herself, to her surprise, laughing more than she had in years. It was during one such dinner, nearly a month after their arrangement had begun, that Lillian noticed Dane watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. "Is something wrong?" she asked, self-consciously touching her hair, which had grown out slightly but was still much shorter than she was used to. Dane shook his head, a faint smile playing at his lips. "Not at all. I was just thinking that your hair suits you even more now than it did when it was first cut. It frames your face beautifully." Lillian felt a blush rise to her cheeks, unused to such direct compliments. "Thank you," she murmured, busying herself with clearing the plates to hide her flustered reaction. Thomas, oblivious to the undercurrent between the adults, piped up, "Mama's the prettiest mama in all of Nevada City. That's what Papa always said." A shadow crossed Lillian's face at the mention of James. Thomas rarely spoke of his father, being too young to have many clear memories of him. Dane, noticing her discomfort, gently redirected the conversation. "Your papa was a very wise man, Thomas, and you're a lucky boy to have such a hard-working and caring mother." Later, As Lillian prepared to leave, bundling Thomas into his coat as the early February twilight descended, Dane stopped her with a light touch on her arm. "Lillian," he began, an unusual hesitancy in his voice. "I hope you know how much I appreciate what you've done here. The cabin has never been so welcoming, and the meals—" He trailed off, seeming to search for words. "It's just simple cooking," Lillian demurred, though his appreciation warmed her. "It's more than that," Dane insisted. "It's having someone to come home to, I suppose. Even if it's just a few days a week." He paused, then added softly, "I've missed that." The vulnerability in his admission caught Lillian off guard. This strong, capable man who commanded horses with ease and navigated the rough world of the frontier with confidence was admitting, in his own way, to loneliness. "We enjoy being here," she said simply, meeting his gaze directly. "Both of us do." Something shifted in Dane's eyes, a warmth that made Lillian's heart beat a little faster. But before he could respond, Thomas tugged at her skirt, ready to go home, and the moment passed. As they walked back to their own cabin in the gathering dusk, Thomas sleepily leaning against her, Lillian found herself thinking about Dane Irving not as her employer, but as a man. A man with kind eyes and gentle hands, who spoke softly to her son and looked at her in a way that made her feel seen for the first time since James had died. It was a dangerous train of thought, she knew. She was a widow with responsibilities, and Dane was only in Nevada City temporarily. Whatever warmth existed between them was likely just the natural result of their arrangement, a friendliness born of proximity and mutual respect. Yet as she tucked Thomas into bed that night, his small face peaceful in sleep, Lillian couldn't help but wonder if perhaps there could be more to life than just surviving. If perhaps, in this harsh frontier town where each day was a struggle, there might be room for something as improbable as new love. The thought both terrified and exhilarated her. And as she drifted off to sleep, her dreams were filled with images of a red-doored cabin, the scent of leather and horses, and a pair of kind blue eyes that seemed to see into her very soul. February gave way to March, bringing with it the first tentative signs of spring to Nevada City. The snow began to melt, revealing patches of muddy ground and the occasional brave crocus pushing its way toward the strengthening sun. The change in seasons seemed to mirror the subtle shift in Lillian's relationship with Dane. What had begun as a straightforward working arrangement had blossomed into something more complex, more meaningful. On the days Lillian worked at the cabin, Dane now made a point of returning early, often bringing small treasures from town: a ribbon for her hair, a piece of rock candy for Thomas, or occasionally a book that they would read together in the evenings before she had to leave. These quiet moments, with Thomas often nodding off in Dane's comfortable armchair while they talked softly by the firelight, had become the highlights of Lillian's week. It was during one such evening, with a gentle spring rain pattering against the windows, that Dane finally spoke of his past. "I wasn't always a horse trainer," he said, his voice low so as not to disturb Thomas, who was dozing nearby. "After my family died, I drifted for a while, worked cattle drives, did some mining, even tried my hand at gambling." He gave a rueful smile. "Wasn't much good at that last one." Lillian listened, her mending forgotten in her lap as Dane continued. "It was on a cattle drive in Wyoming that I discovered my way with horses. The trail boss had a stallion no one could handle, a beautiful animal, but wild as the wind. For some reason, he took to me." Dane's eyes softened at the memory. "That horse saved my life in a way, gave me purpose when I didn't have any." "What happened to him?" Lillian asked, drawn into the story. "I trained him, rode with him for years, named him Phoenix rising from the ashes and all that." Dane's voice held a note of sadness. Lost him 2 winters ago to a mountain lion. By then, though, I'd made a name for myself with horses, especially the difficult ones. That's how Wilson heard of me." Lillian reached out impulsively, placing her hand over his. "I'm sorry about Phoenix. It sounds like he was special to you." Dane turned his hand, capturing hers in a gentle grip. "He was, but that's life on the frontier, full of losses." His gaze met hers, intense and searching, and occasionally unexpected joys. The air between them seemed to thicken, charged with unspoken emotions. Lillian was acutely aware of the warmth of his hand holding hers, the way his thumb traced small circles on her palm. It had been so long since she'd been touched with such tenderness, such care. "Dane," she whispered, not sure what she wanted to say, only knowing that something important was happening between them. He leaned forward slightly, his free hand reaching up to gently brush a strand of hair from her face. "Lillian," a small voice interrupted them. "Mama." "Is it time to go home?" They pulled apart quickly, the moment broken by Thomas's sleepy inquiry. Dane cleared his throat, rising from his chair with a slightly flustered air that Lillian found endearing. "It is getting late," he acknowledged, glancing out at the rain-soaked darkness. "But it's coming down pretty hard out there. Why don't I harness Copper to the small cart and drive you both home?" "Oh, we couldn't impose," Lillian began, but Dane cut her off with a gentle smile. "It's no imposition. I wouldn't sleep well knowing you were trudging through mud and rain." His expression softened as he looked at Thomas, who was rubbing his eyes tiredly. "Besides, I think this young cowboy is about ready to fall asleep on his feet." The ride to Lillian's cabin was quiet. The only sounds the steady clip-clop of Copper's hooves and the rhythmic swish of the cart's wheels through puddles. Thomas dozed against Lillian's side, while she was acutely aware of Dane's presence next to her, the breadth of his shoulders blocking some of the rain, the clean scent of soap and leather that seemed to cling to him. When they reached her cabin, Dane insisted on carrying the sleeping Thomas inside, laying him gently on his small bed while Lillian removed his muddy boots. Together, they tucked the boy in, their hands brushing as they pulled the blanket up to his chin. In the main room of the cabin, with Thomas safely asleep, an awkward silence fell between them. The moment they'd shared earlier hung in the air, unacknowledged yet impossible to ignore. "Thank you for bringing us home," Lillian finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. Dane nodded, his eyes never leaving her face. "Lillian, about earlier, it's late," she interrupted, suddenly afraid of what he might say, of the feelings he might voice that would echo too closely the ones she was trying to suppress. "You should get back before the rain worsens." A flash of disappointment crossed Dane's features, but he nodded again, respecting her implicit request for space. "Of course. I'll see you on Friday." "Yes, Friday," she confirmed, walking him to the door. He paused on the threshold, raindrops immediately speckling his broad shoulders. "Good night, Lillian." "Good night, Dane." She watched from the doorway as he mounted Copper and rode away, the rain blurring his silhouette until he was just a shadow in the darkness. Closing the door, Lillian leaned against it, her heart pounding with emotion she hadn't felt in years: desire, hope, and most terrifying of all, the possibility of love. But with those emotions came fear. She had known the devastation of loss once before, had experienced the crushing weight of grief and the struggle of raising a child alone. Could she risk her heart again? Risk Thomas's heart? Dane had admitted himself that he was only in Nevada City temporarily. What would happen when his work for Wilson was complete? Sleep eluded her that night, her mind turning over these questions again and again. By morning, she had made a decision. Whatever was developing between her and Dane, she would proceed with caution. Thomas's well-being had to come first, and she couldn't afford to be swept away by feelings that might lead to more heartbreak. This resolve lasted precisely 3 days, until she arrived at the red-doored cabin on Friday to find Dane waiting for her, a bouquet of wildflowers in his hand and a nervous expression on his face. "I thought you'd be at the ranch," she said, surprised to see him. "I wanted to talk to you," he replied, holding out the flowers. "These reminded me of you, resilient, beautiful, thriving despite difficult circumstances." Lillian accepted the bouquet, her fingers trembling slightly as they brushed against his. "Dane, please let me speak," he interrupted gently. "I've been thinking about what almost happened the other night, and I want you to know that I have nothing but respect for you, Lillian. If I overstepped, I apologize." "You didn't overstep," she assured him quietly. Relief flooded his features. "Then perhaps you'll allow me to be straightforward. I've grown to care for you, Lillian, and for Thomas. More than I expected, more than might be wise given my temporary situation here." He took a deep breath. "But I find that I can't ignore these feelings, nor do I want to." Lillian's heart raced, her carefully constructed resolve weakening at his honest declaration. "I care for you too," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "But I'm afraid, Dane. I have Thomas to consider, and you'll be leaving when your work is done, and I can't put us through another loss." Dane stepped closer, his eyes serious. "What if I wasn't leaving? What if I told you that George Wilson has offered me a permanent position managing his stables?" Hope flared in Lillian's chest, almost painful in its intensity. "Has he?" "He has," Dane confirmed. "And I've been considering it. But before I gave him my answer, I wanted to know." He hesitated, then continued, his voice gaining strength. "I wanted to know if there might be a reason for me to stay in Nevada City, beyond just the job." The implication was clear, hanging in the air between them like the delicate scent of the wildflowers she clutched. "Dane," Lillian breathed, her resolve crumbling entirely. But she never finished her sentence, because Dane had closed the distance between them, his hands gently cradling her face as his lips found hers in a kiss that was both tender and intense, a kiss that spoke of longing held in check for too long. Lillian responded with a fervor that surprised her, the wildflowers crushed between them as her free hand reached up to curl around his neck. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Dane rested his forehead against hers. "I take it that's a yes," he murmured, a smile in his voice. Lillian laughed softly, joy bubbling up inside her like a spring. "It's a yes. There's definitely a reason for you to stay." From that day forward, everything changed, yet in some ways, nothing changed at all. Lillian still came to the cabin 3 times a week, still cleaned and mended and cooked. But now there were stolen kisses in the kitchen, long conversations by the fire after Thomas was asleep, and a growing sense of belonging that filled the spaces in her heart she had thought would remain empty forever. Dane formally accepted Wilson's offer, securing his future in Nevada City. And as April bloomed into May, he approached Lillian with another proposition altogether. They were standing in the lean-to, watching Thomas brush Star with careful, reverent strokes under Dane's guidance. The boy had grown confident around the horses, showing a natural affinity that delighted Dane. Lillian smiled at the scene, her heart full as she observed the bond between the man she loved and her son. "He's good with her," she commented, leaning against the wooden post. "He is," Dane agreed, pride evident in his voice. "He's got a gift." He turned to face her fully, his expression suddenly serious. "Lillian, I've been thinking." "That sounds dangerous," she teased, but her smile faded as she registered the intensity in his gaze. "Dane, what is it?" He took her hands in his touch warm and familiar now. "This cabin, it's too small for one person, let alone 3. And with the position at Wilson's, I'll have access to housing on the ranch property. Larger quarters with a small garden plot and proximity to the stables. Lillian's breath caught as she began to understand where he was leading. "Dane, are you asking you to marry me?" he finished for her, a smile breaking across his face. "Yes, I believe I am." He squeezed her hands gently. "I love you, Lillian Davenport, and I love that boy over there as if he were my own. I want us to be a family, a real family." Tears welled in Lillian's eyes, spilling over before she could stop them. "Oh, Dane," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. For a terrible moment, Dane misinterpreted her tears. "If it's too soon, I understand." "We can wait, take more time." "No," Lillian interrupted, laughing through her tears. "It's not too soon. It's perfect. Yes, Dane Irving, I will marry you." His answering smile was radiant as he pulled her into his arms, lifting her off her feet in his joy. Their laughter alerted Thomas, who abandoned his brushing to see what the commotion was about. "Why are you crying, Mama?" he asked, concern furrowing his small brow. "Are you sad?" Lillian knelt down to his level, her face glowing with happiness despite her tears. "No, sweetheart. These are happy tears. Sometimes people cry when they're very, very happy." Thomas looked skeptical. "Why are you so happy?" Dane knelt beside her, his arm slipping around her waist. "Well, Thomas, I've asked your mama a very important question. I've asked her to marry me, which means that you and she would come live with me and we would be a family." The boy's eyes widened. "Like having a new papa," Dane nodded solemnly. "If you'd want me to be, I could never replace your real papa, but I would be honored to be your second papa." Thomas considered this for a long moment, his young face serious with thought. Then he looked at his mother. "Would we still get to see the horses every day?" Lillian laughed, relief and joy mingling in the sound. "Yes, love. We'd live right near the stables." "Then I think it's a good idea," Thomas decided, with the simple clarity of childhood. He stepped forward and wrapped his small arms around Dane's neck in a spontaneous hug. "I always wanted a papa who knows about horses." Dane's eyes met Lillian's over the boy's shoulder, a sheen of moisture visible in the blue depths. In that moment, Lillian knew with absolute certainty that she had made the right choice. This man, this kind, gentle, strong man who had stepped into their lives on the day she was ready to sacrifice her beauty for her child's welfare, was exactly what both she and Thomas needed. The wedding took place in early June, a simple ceremony in the small church in Nevada City. Lillian wore a dress of pale blue, her now shoulder-length hair adorned with the wildflowers that grew abundantly in the meadows around town. Thomas, dressed in his Sunday best, stood proudly beside them, solemnly handing over the rings when the time came. Their new home on the Wilson Ranch was everything Dane had promised: spacious, comfortable, with a garden that Lillian immediately began to fill with vegetables and flowers. Thomas thrived in the open spaces, learning about horses from Dane and making friends with the children of other ranch workers. As summer stretched into fall and fall gave way to winter, Lillian often found herself reflecting on the strange twists of fate that had led her to this happiness. Had she not entered that barber shop on that cold January day, had Dane not walked in at precisely that moment, had he not been moved to intervene, their paths might never have crossed. One evening, as they sat on the porch of their home watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink, Thomas playing with a new wooden horse in the yard, Dane voiced a similar thought. "You ever think about that day in the barber shop?" he asked, his arm around her shoulders, drawing her close against the chill of the evening air. Lillian nodded, leaning into his warmth. "Often. It's strange to think that something that felt so desperate, so humiliating at the time, could lead to this." She gestured to their home, to Thomas, to the contentment that now filled her days. "I've never told you," Dane said slowly, "but I wasn't supposed to be there that day. I had no need for a haircut or a shave. I was on my way to the saloon, but some impulse I can't explain made me turn into the barber shop instead." Lillian looked up at him, surprised by this revelation. "Really? You never mentioned that." Dane shrugged, a smile playing at his lips. "Maybe it was fate, or divine intervention, or just blind luck, but I'm grateful for whatever it was every single day." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "The moment I saw you in that chair, something inside me just knew that you were important, that I needed to help you to know you. Even with my hair being chopped off." She teased, though the memory still held a touch of sadness. "Especially then," Dane insisted, his voice growing serious. "Because in that moment I saw something rare, a mother's love so fierce, so selfless, that she would sacrifice her own beauty for her child. How could I not be moved by that? How could I not want to know the woman capable of such love?" Lillian felt tears prick at her eyes, moved by his words. "And now," Dane turned to face her fully, his hands framing her face with infinite tenderness, "now I know that love firsthand. Now it encompasses me and Thomas," and he placed a gentle hand on her belly, where the first subtle signs of their child were just beginning to show, "this little one. And I am humbled by it, Lillian. Humbled and grateful beyond words." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across their yard, Thomas ran up to them, his wooden horse clutched proudly in his small hand. "Look, Papa, I taught him to jump fences." "Did you now?" Dane grinned, lifting the boy onto his lap. "That's quite a skill. You'll have to show me." Lillian watched them together, her heart so full it felt it might burst. From the depths of despair, from a moment of ultimate sacrifice, she had found not just survival but joy, not just existence but life abundant. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Lillian silently thanked whatever force had guided Dane Irving into that barber shop on that cold January day. For in saving her hair, he had given her so much more. He had given her a future, a family, and a love that would sustain her through all the seasons to come. And as Thomas's laughter rang out in the gathering dusk, as Dane's arm tightened protectively around her shoulders, Lillian Davenport Irving knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be, her son fed, her heart full, and her life richer than she had ever dared to dream possible in the wild frontier of Nevada City. Winter gave way to spring, and with the first warm days of April, Lillian felt the stirrings of their child grow stronger. Her belly had swelled to a prominent curve, and Thomas had become fascinated with the idea of becoming a big brother, often pressing his ear against her stomach to listen for sounds of the baby. "What will we name him, Mama?" Thomas asked one evening as Dane tucked him into bed. "If it's a brother, I mean." Lillian smiled, exchanging a glance with Dane. "We haven't decided yet, sweetheart, and it might be a sister, you know." Thomas wrinkled his nose. "I'd rather have a brother, someone to ride horses with," Dane chuckled, ruffling the boy's hair. "Girls can ride horses too, Thomas. Some of the best riders I've known were women." "Really?" Thomas's eyes widened with interest. "Absolutely. There was a woman named Annie Oakley I saw perform once. She could outshoot and outride most men." As Thomas peppered Dane with questions about Annie Oakley's exploits, Lillian watched them with a heart full of gratitude. Dane had slipped so seamlessly into the role of father, his patience and understanding seemingly limitless when it came to Thomas's endless curiosity. Later, as they retired to their own bedroom, Dane pulled Lillian close, his hand resting protectively over their growing child. "Have you thought about names?" he asked softly. Lillian leaned into his embrace, considering. If it's a boy, I thought perhaps James, after his father. She glanced up at Dane, uncertain how he might feel about her suggestion, but Dane nodded, his expression serious. I think that would be a fine tribute. James was Thomas's father, and he'll always be a part of who Thomas is, a part of your story. The generosity of spirit in his acceptance made Lillian love him all the more. And if it's a girl, my mother's name was Alina, Dane said thoughtfully, but I've always been fond of the name Grace. Alina Grace, Lillian tested the name, feeling it on her tongue. It's beautiful. As spring blossomed into summer, Lillian's pregnancy progressed, and the baby's movements grew more pronounced. Dane, though busy with his work at the stables, made time each evening to talk to their unborn child, telling stories of horses and adventures that made both Lillian and Thomas laugh. One sweltering July afternoon, as Lillian sat in the shade of their porch shelling peas, a sharp pain seized her lower back. She gasped, the bowl nearly slipping from her lap. The pain subsided, and she dismissed it as a normal discomfort of late pregnancy. But when it returned an hour later, stronger and more insistent, she knew. Thomas was at a neighbor's farm, playing with their children, and Dane was in the stables, working with a new colt that had just arrived. Lillian made her way carefully toward the stables, pausing every few minutes as contractions gripped her. She found Dane in the corral, his attention focused on a spirited young horse that pranced nervously around him. Not wanting to startle either of them, she waited by the fence until Dane glanced her way. The moment he saw her, his expression changed, concern replacing concentration as he immediately handed the lead rope to an assistant and hurried to her side. "Is it time?" he asked, his voice steady though his eyes betrayed his anxiety. Lillian nodded, grimacing as another contraction began. "I think so. But it's coming fast, Dane, faster than with Thomas." Dane didn't hesitate. He scooped her into his arms, ignoring her weak protests that she could walk, and carried her back to their home. With quick, efficient movements, he settled her on their bed and dispatched a stable boy to fetch both the midwife and Thomas from the neighbors. The midwife, Mrs. Holloway, arrived within the hour, her weathered face calm and reassuring as she examined Lillian. "You're right, dear. This little one is in quite a hurry to meet the world. I'd say we'll have a baby before sunset." Thomas burst into the bedroom moments later, his face a mixture of excitement and worry. "Is the baby coming, Mama?" "Right now. Soon, love," Lillian managed between breaths. "But you'll need to stay with Papa outside for a while. Mrs. Holloway and I have work to do." Dane lifted Thomas into his arms. "Come on, partner. Let's give your mama some privacy. We'll wait in the sitting room and Mrs. Holloway will call us when it's time to meet your new brother or sister." As labor progressed, the pains coming faster and more intense, Lillian was grateful for both Mrs. Holloway's experienced hands and the sounds of Dane and Thomas in the next room, their muffled voices a comforting reminder of why she was enduring this pain. Dane came in periodically, wiping her brow with a cool cloth, murmuring words of encouragement, his presence a steady anchor in the storm of labor. Just as the sun began to sink toward the horizon, painting the bedroom walls with golden light, Alina Grace Irving entered the world with a lusty cry that immediately brought tears to Lillian's eyes. "A girl, Mrs. Holloway announced, cleaning the baby efficiently before placing her in Lillian's eager arms. "And a strong one at that." Dane, who had been allowed in for the final moments, stood at the bedside, his face a study in wonder as he gazed at his daughter. "She's perfect," he whispered, reaching out to touch the tiny hand that had escaped from the swaddling. "Just like her mother. Shall we let the big brother in?" Mrs. Holloway asked with a smile, already moving toward the door. Thomas approached the bed with unusual caution, his eyes wide as he peered at the small bundle in Lillian's arms. "She's very red," he observed with the blunt honesty of childhood. Dane laughed, lifting Thomas onto the bed for a better look. "All babies are red at first, son. She'll change." Thomas reached out tentatively to touch his sister's cheek. "Hello, Eleanor," he said solemnly. "I'm your big brother, Thomas." "Eleanor Grace," Lillian corrected gently, "but we can call her Ellie for short." "Ellie," Thomas repeated, trying out the name. He looked up at Dane. "Can she ride horses when she gets bigger?" Dane nodded, his arm around Thomas's shoulders. "If she wants to, absolutely. But it might be a few years before she's ready for that." In the following days, as Lillian recovered and Ellie settled into life outside the womb, their home was filled with a new kind of joy. Dane proved to be as adept with a newborn as he was with wild horses, pacing the floor with Ellie in the small hours when she was fussy, changing her with surprising dexterity, and looking at her with such love that Lillian's heart swelled every time she witnessed it. Thomas, too, embraced his role as big brother with enthusiasm, eager to help fetch clean cloths or sing to Ellie when she cried. The family settled into a new rhythm, their days marked by feedings and naps, their nights by whispered conversations as they marveled at their daughter's tiny perfection. On a warm evening in early August, as Ellie slept peacefully in her cradle and Thomas dozed on the sofa, exhausted from a day spent learning to ride his first pony, Dane led Lillian out onto their porch. The stars were just beginning to appear, the air still holding the day's warmth. "I have something for you," Dane said, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small velvet pouch. "I've been saving for this since before Ellie was born, but with everything happening, I never found the right moment." Curious, Lillian opened the pouch, gasping softly as a delicate gold locket slid into her palm. It was exquisitely crafted with an intricate floral design etched on its surface. "Open it," Dane encouraged. Inside, she found a small lock of her own golden hair on one side, hair she had been prepared to sell that fateful day in the barber shop, and on the other side, a tiny curl of Ellie's downy newborn hair. "How did you?" Lillian began, her voice catching with emotion. "I asked Mr. Johnson to save a lock of your hair that day," Dane explained. "I don't know why it seemed important somehow, even then, and I've kept it all this time, waiting for the right moment to give it back to you." Lillian traced the locket with her finger, tears welling in her eyes. "It's beautiful, Dane. The most thoughtful gift I've ever received." Dane fastened the locket around her neck, his fingers lingering on the delicate skin of her nape. "I want you to always remember that day, not because of what you were willing to sacrifice, but because of what it led to. Our family. Our life together." Lillian turned in his arms, standing on tiptoe to kiss him with all the love she felt. "I could never forget. That day changed everything." As they stood together under the vast canopy of stars, Lillian marveled at the journey that had brought them to this moment. From the depths of desperation in that barber's chair to this, a home filled with love, a son growing strong and confident, a newborn daughter, and a husband who saw her strength even in her moments of greatest vulnerability. The years would bring challenges, she knew. Life on the frontier was never easy. But with Dane by her side, with their children to raise and love, Lillian faced the future not with fear but with hope, hope as bright and enduring as the gold locket that now lay against her heart. A tangible reminder that sometimes the darkest moments can lead to the brightest beginnings. As summer gave way to fall and fall to winter once more, the Irving family settled into the rhythms of their life together. Ellie grew from a newborn to an active infant, her chubby hands reaching for everything, her laughs and cries filling their home with a new kind of music. Thomas, now 5, started his lessons at the small schoolhouse in Nevada City, proudly carrying his slate and books each morning, returning with stories of new friends and new knowledge that he eagerly shared at dinner. Dane's reputation as a horse trainer continued to grow, bringing visitors from as far away as San Francisco to the Wilson Ranch. George Wilson, recognizing Dane's value, expanded his responsibilities and increased his pay accordingly. With the extra money, they were able to make improvements to their home: a new roof, glass windows to replace the oiled paper ones, and a proper kitchen that delighted Lillian with its spaciousness and the luxury of a pump indoors. On a crisp December morning, just over a year after Ellie's birth, Lillian stood at her new kitchen window, watching as Dane and Thomas built a snowman in the yard. Ellie sat on her hip, babbling happily and pointing at her father and brother. Lillian's hair, now grown out to well past her shoulders, was caught up in a simple braid, though a few strands had escaped to frame her face. "Look at Papa and Thomas, Ellie," she said, bouncing the baby gently. "They're making a snow friend for you." Ellie squealed in delight, her small hands patting against the window pane. At 13 months, she was already showing signs of having inherited her mother's golden hair and her father's bright blue eyes, a perfect blend of them both. The door burst open, bringing with it a gust of cold air and two snow-covered figures. "Mama, we made the biggest snowman ever," Thomas exclaimed, his cheeks red with cold and excitement. "Papa says we can make a snow horse next." Dane laughed, brushing snow from his coat before hanging it by the door. "I said we could try. I'm not promising it will look much like a horse." He crossed to Lillian and Ellie, kissing them both before warming his hands at the stove. "It's getting colder out there. We might be in for a proper storm tonight." Lillian nodded, handing Ellie to him as she moved to prepare hot chocolate for Thomas. "I noticed the clouds building. Do you think you'll need to go out to the stables later?" "Probably," Dane acknowledged, making a funny face at Ellie that caused her to giggle. "Wilson's got a new mare that's close to foaling. I want to check on her before the worst of the weather hits." As they settled around the table with hot chocolate and fresh bread, Thomas regaled them with stories from school and plans for the snow horse. Ellie babbled and played with her spoon, and Dane and Lillian exchanged glances over their children's heads, glances full of love and contentment, and the quiet joy of ordinary moments shared. Later, as dusk fell and the promised storm began to gather strength, Lillian stood on the porch watching Dane make his way toward the stables. The wind had picked up, sending swirls of snow dancing across the yard, but the path was still clear enough for safe passage. Still, a sense of unease settled over her, a vague premonition that she tried to dismiss as mere worry. "Be careful," she called after him, her voice nearly lost in the wind. Dane turned, raising a hand in acknowledgement before disappearing into the swirling snow. Inside, Lillian busied herself with bedtime routines: a story for Thomas, a lullaby for Ellie, the banking of the fire to keep the house warm through the night. But as the hours passed and Dane didn't return, her unease grew. The storm had strengthened, the wind howling around the eaves of their home, snow piling against the windows in drifts that obscured the view outside. By midnight, Lillian was pacing, her worry a living thing in her chest. Dane was experienced with winter storms, yes, but this one had turned vicious with unexpected speed. Had he decided to stay at the stables, or was he trying to make his way home even now, lost in the blinding snow? Just as she was considering bundling up to go search for him, a foolhardy plan she knew, the door burst open. Dane stumbled in, covered in snow, his face red with cold but his eyes bright with excitement. "Lillian," he exclaimed, stamping snow from his boots. "Come quickly. The mare, she's foaled, and you won't believe what's happened." Relief flooded through Lillian, momentarily overwhelming her concern at his appearance and his odd request. "Dane, you're half frozen. You need to warm up before. There's no time," he insisted, grabbing her coat and holding it out to her. "Trust me, you'll want to see this. The children are asleep." Lillian nodded, allowing him to help her into her coat. "Yes, but I don't understand. You will," he promised, leading her out into the storm. The wind bit at her face as they made their way toward the stables, Dane breaking a path through the snow for her to follow. Inside, the warm, familiar scent of hay and horses greeted them, along with the soft whickering of the animals disturbed from their rest. Dane led her to a stall at the far end, where a beautiful bay mare lay in fresh straw, her sides heaving slightly from the exertion of birth. Beside her, not one but two foals huddled, their spindly legs folded beneath them, their wet coats already beginning to dry and fluff. "Twins," Lillian breathed in amazement. Twin foals were incredibly rare, and even more rarely did both survive birth. "Yes," Dane said, his voice full of wonder. "Two fillies, both healthy as far as I can tell. It's a miracle, Lillian. I've never seen anything like it in all my years with horses." As they watched, one of the foals struggled to its feet, wobbling precariously before finding its balance. The other soon followed, both moving to nurse from their mother, who nickered softly in encouragement. "Wilson will be beside himself," Dane laughed softly. "These are valuable animals, and to have two instead of one, it's extraordinary. What will he name them?" Lillian asked, charmed by the sight of the twin foals, so alike yet each with its own distinct markings. Dane slipped an arm around her waist, drawing her close against the chill that still lingered in the stable despite the lanterns and the body heat of the horses. "That's the other surprise. Wilson said if the foal was a filly, I could name her. He never expected to, so I suppose both naming rights fall to me." He paused, looking down at her with a smile. "I thought perhaps Lily for one after you." Lillian felt a rush of pleasure at the idea. "And the other?" "Well," Dane said thoughtfully, "Thomas has been asking for his own pony. He's outgrowing the shared mount he uses now." He met her eyes, his expression suddenly serious. "Wilson has offered me a partnership, Lillian, a small share in the ranch, focusing specifically on breeding and training. And these fillies, he's proposed that one of them become part of my payment." Lillian's eyes widened. "A partnership? Dane, that's wonderful news." "It is," he agreed. "It means security for us, for the children. And it means," he glanced at the second foal, who had settled back down beside her mother, "it means that in a few years Thomas will have a horse of his own, a special one." Understanding dawned on Lillian's face. "You want to name the second filly after Thomas?" Dane chuckled. "Not exactly. I was thinking Dawn, since she was born just before dawn. But she'll be his when she's old enough to train his responsibility, his partner, just as Lily will be Ellie's someday." The generosity of the gesture brought tears to Lillian's eyes. "He'll be over the moon," she whispered, leaning into Dane's embrace. "Both of them will be when they're old enough to understand." They stayed a while longer, watching the new family settle, before making their way back through the storm to their own home. Inside, with the door securely latched against the howling wind, Lillian helped Dane out of his snow-covered clothes and into dry ones, insisting he sit close to the fire with a cup of hot coffee to ward off any chill that might have settled in his bones. "You could have frozen out there," she scolded gently, though her eyes betrayed her love. "The foals would have still been there in the morning." Dane caught her hand, pulling her down to sit beside him. "I couldn't wait to show you, and I couldn't wait to tell you about Wilson's offer. It changes everything, Lillian. We're not just surviving anymore, we're building something lasting, something that will provide for our children and even their children someday." Lillian rested her head on his shoulder, watching the fire's glow. "From the moment you walked into that barber shop, you've been changing our lives for the better. Thomas and I were barely surviving, and now—" She gestured around their comfortable home, toward the rooms where their children slept peacefully despite the storm. "Now we have all this. A family. A future." "We built it together," Dane corrected gently. "Your strength, your love for Thomas, your willingness to do whatever it took to care for him, that's what caught my attention that day. Everything that's come since has been because of that strength, not in spite of it." As the storm raged outside, they sat together in the warm circle of firelight, talking of the future of the partnership with Wilson, of Thomas's education, of Ellie's first steps which seemed imminent, of the twin fillies who would one day belong to their children. They spoke of dreams that had once seemed impossible, but now felt within reach, of hopes that had been buried during hard times, but now flourished in the fertile soil of their shared life. And when the fire had burned low, they retired to their bedroom, their love for each other as strong and vital as it had been since the beginning, yet deepened by the years and experiences they had shared. In the quiet darkness, with the storm gradually subsiding outside, they found in each other's arms the peace and passion that had sustained them through every challenge, every joy, every ordinary day of their extraordinary journey together. Spring arrived early the following year, bringing with it new growth and new possibilities. The twin fillies, Lily and Dawn, thrived under Dane's careful attention, growing strong and spirited. Thomas, now 6, spent every available moment at the stables, watching their progress with proprietary pride, especially once Dane explained that Dawn would one day be his. Ellie, at 18 months, was walking confidently and beginning to form words, her favorite being horsey, which she exclaimed with delight whenever Dane took her to visit the stables. Her golden curls had grown into a halo around her cherubic face, and her blue eyes sparkled with the same intelligence and curiosity that Lillian had first noticed in Dane's gaze. The partnership with Wilson had transformed their financial situation, allowing for further improvements to their home and the luxury of occasional trips to Sacramento or San Francisco. On one such trip, Dane surprised Lillian with a visit to a photographer's studio, where they sat for a family portrait, Thomas standing tall and serious beside Dane's chair, Lillian seated with Ellie on her lap, all of them dressed in their finest clothes. "A memento," Dane explained as they left the studio, the photographer promising to send the finished portraits within a month. "Something for the children to have someday, to remember these times." As they walked along Sacramento's busy streets, Lillian noticed a barber shop much like the one in Nevada City where their story had begun. She paused, a smile playing at her lips as she touched the locket that still hung around her neck. "What are you thinking?" Dane asked, following her gaze. "Just that life takes such unexpected turns," she replied. "If someone had told me 3 years ago that my lowest moment would lead to all this happiness, I wouldn't have believed it possible." Dane squeezed her hand. "I'm grateful every day for whatever twist of fate led me to that barber shop at that precise moment. And I'm even more grateful that you were brave enough to accept help from a stranger." "Not a stranger for long," Lillian pointed out. "You became family so quickly. It's hard to remember a time when you weren't part of our lives." Back in Nevada City, as spring blossomed into summer, their family settled into the pleasant routines of their expanded life. Dane's work with the horses kept him busy but fulfilled, his natural affinity for the animals making him both respected and sought after throughout the region. Lillian, with Ellie often at her hip or playing nearby, tended their garden, managed their home, and occasionally helped with the accounts for the breeding program, her neat handwriting and quick mind making her a valuable partner in the business as well as in life. On a warm July evening, as they celebrated Ellie's second birthday with a small gathering of friends and neighbors, Lillian found herself watching her family with a heart so full it seemed it might burst. Thomas was teaching some of the other children a game involving horse races, his confidence and kindness making him a natural leader. Ellie toddled among the adults, charming everyone with her sunny smile and happy babbling. And Dane moved through it all with the easy grace that had first attracted Lillian, his affection for their children evident in every interaction, his love for her clear in the glances they exchanged across the yard. Later, after the guests had departed and the children were tucked into bed, exhausted from the day's excitement, Dane and Lillian sat on their porch in the gathering dusk. The air was still warm, scented with the roses that climbed the trellis Dane had built for Lillian's birthday earlier that year. "Happy?" Dane asked, his arm around her shoulders, his fingers playing with a strand of her hair that now fell nearly to her waist again, as golden as it had been on the day they met. "Completely," Lillian confirmed, leaning into his embrace. "Though I was thinking today about how quickly they're growing. Thomas starts second grade in the fall and Ellie is no longer a baby." "Does that make you sad?" Dane inquired gently. Lillian considered the question. "Not sad exactly. But sometimes I miss the baby stages, even though they were exhausting. The way they fit perfectly in your arms, the first smiles, the first steps." Dane was quiet for a moment, his hand moving to rest lightly on her abdomen. "Would you consider having another?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Not right away, perhaps, but someday." Lillian placed her hand over his, a slow smile spreading across her face. "I've been considering it more than you know," she admitted. "In fact, I've been meaning to tell you something." Dane's eyes widened as understanding dawned. "Lillian, are you?" She nodded, joy bubbling up inside her. "Dr. Hayes confirmed it last week. We'll have a new edition sometime in January." Dane's whoop of delight startled a nesting bird from a nearby tree. He pulled Lillian to her feet, spinning her in a circle before setting her down with exaggerated care, suddenly mindful of her condition. "Another baby," he marveled, his hands cradling her face. "Another piece of us both. Are you pleased?" Lillian asked, though his reaction had already given her the answer. "Beyond pleased," Dane assured her, kissing her with a tenderness that still made her heart race after all their time together. "I love our family, Lillian. I love the life we've built. And I love the idea of adding to it, of watching another child grow and thrive under your care, under our care." As they stood together in the soft summer twilight, arms around each other and hearts aligned in shared joy, Lillian reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. From the desperate woman willing to sell her hair to feed her son, to this, a beloved wife and mother, secure in her family's love and future. The path had not always been easy, but it had led her to a happiness more profound than she had ever imagined possible. "What are you thinking about?" Dane asked, noticing her contemplative expression. Lillian smiled up at him, her eyes shining with love and gratitude. "I'm thinking that sometimes, the things we're most afraid to lose, our pride, our independence, even our hair, are the very things we need to let go of to find something better. Something lasting." Dane nodded, understanding her reference to that fateful day in the barber shop. "And I'm thinking," he replied, his voice low and filled with emotion, "that the true beauty of a woman has nothing to do with her hair but everything to do with her heart. And yours, Lillian Irving, is the most beautiful I've ever known." As the stars began to appear overhead, as the children slept peacefully inside their home, As the new life grew within her, Lillian stood in the circle of Dane's arms, surrounded by the love that had transformed her life. From sacrifice had come abundance. From desperation, hope. From a chance encounter, a love story that would continue to unfold, page by page, day by day, for all the years to come. And she knew, with the certainty that comes from having walked through fire and emerged stronger, that no matter what challenges the future might hold, they would face them together, this family forged in hardship but flourishing in love. This legacy built on the foundation of one man's kindness and one woman's courage on a cold winter day in Nevada City, when a desperate act had become the first chapter of their shared story.